read Losers last night.
Oh, thanks.
It was such a pleasure.
Oh, good.
I was really interested in this quite surprising link that you made between all the glitches on Zoom and
Yes.
your thoughts around losing.
Mm.
I wondered if you could say something about that.
Yes. Well, I was very much aware going into lockdown and moving my practice to Zoom. I was just aware immediately of how much I would be losing. And in fact, in the first instance, I panicked a bit and wondered whether it would even be possible. I had probably done, a handful of certainly Zoom sessions, probably not even that. I didn't think I'd worked on Zoom before. I'd done some sessions on the phone. It's very much a temporary expedient. If a patient is away and unable to, sort of really feels that they can't miss the session, then, I'll agree to do it on the phone. Or in certain circumstances, there are periods, for example, when the patient has just had a baby, and it's not possible for them to get in. But the fact that something is very transient allows it to stand in for the real encounter. Just losing that, losing the sense of temporariness and feeling that this was an open-ended setup, an open-ended frame for psychoanalysis, was a completely different prospect. And so I went into it feeling that there was just so much to lose, and now I'm back in person with, say, probably about half of my patients now. I have a renewed awareness of what was lost. But I think what I was trying to talk about in the book was how these undoubted losses were also more subtle gains, and that there was something about the universality of my situation or its continuity with what everybody else was experiencing, the difficulty really of projecting onto me this fantasy of the analyst who's above the fray, who's outside of the continuity of the rest of the world, who occupies a kind of space above and beyond. All of those fantasies about the analyst were kind of stripped away at a stroke. And, I was in a room in my house, and there was no real way of disguising that or pretending it was otherwise. Because even if, I sort of put a full setting in the background or whitened the room so that you would have no way of knowing in what kind of place I was, you would still be aware of me as a human being, protecting himself and his patients, and sort of as vulnerable and as anxious as everybody else. And I think that there was something about that felt to me like a gain, like a sort of unwitting and involuntary disclosure of not me particularly as a person, but just the fact of my shared humanity. And I thought that was a sort of interesting way into talking about losing as a human condition rather than as a set of discrete experiences.
There's something about like a shared vulnerability that you have thought of as a gain in this instance. Why do you think that's a gain?
Because I think it gives, if we're talking about psychoanalysis specifically, I suppose it gives me the opportunity to have a different kind of conscious and unconscious communication. Something about the tenor of communication on Zoom changed a little bit. The sort of what's interesting is that if you practice psychoanalysis in a fairly traditional way, people adapt themselves to the frame generally very quickly. Often they'll come in and say, "Oh, hi, how are you?" or something right at the beginning. And very soon they just learn not to do that, to see that there is something really valuable about maintaining a frame which isn't intruded upon by the conventions of ordinary conversation. But I suppose it can also lead to a kind of automatic loss of the analyst as an ordinary person. I always think that it's important in psychoanalysis to be very natural, to be sort of to speak as your ordinary self in your own voice. Never, of course, to lapse into psychoanalytic jargon, but also not to be too careful to sort of put bounds around your ordinary way of speaking, your manner. But nonetheless, the frame itself, the fact that, there's conventions of non-disclosure, of beginning and ending the session on time, of course, focusing the conversation entirely on the patient. All of that means that it's very easy for the analyst to get occluded as somebody real in a real situation. And I think shared vulnerability and the experience of shared vulnerability automatically and without any design or contrivance on the analyst's part just puts you in a very human position. And the gain is simply, I think it has a lot to do with it being unexpected. I don't think it's something you can strive for. I think it would always be a mistake, for me anyway, in psychoanalysis to start disclosing stuff about yourself and trying to communicate your shared vulnerability, because in a way the whole practice works by removing yourself to some degree, withholding yourself, but when it happens contingently in the way that it did, then it's a kind of gift. When an outside event intrudes to make a different aspect of yourself known willy-nilly, I think that there are new layers of conscious and unconscious communication between analyst and patient, and that feels to me like a gain, even if simply by virtue of the fact that it's something new. It's a new element that's introduced into the analytic conversation. I had a dog at home, so she would often, particularly when we were alone in the house, she would often scratch outside the door. So I had the choice: either I leave her scratching outside, which is an awful noise and it's going to damage the door, or I let her in. But letting her in, people see the kind of dog I have. People see something of her relationship to me, her neediness, and and my they will pick up something of my relationship to her as well. And there doesn't seem to be a way around that. It's nothing that anybody has sought or contrived, but I do think that external contingent impositions often are a kind of gift.
So your dog did come into the room?
Yeah, she did, yeah.
And I suppose this is a consulting room, you don't have your... Would you ever consider having your dog come in?
My dog, no, because I think, asking her, I mean, I'm here, 8-9 sessions a day, and I'm here really from 7 in the morning till 7 in the evening, asking her to sort of, stay regulated and calm and quiet for all that time is too much to ask of her. But I have had other people's dogs come in, which is also sort of an interesting choice to have to make. But I've had 1 or 2 people say, I can't come because I can't leave the dog, or I've got the dog with me, and I've said, well, are they able to stay, still and quiet in the room? And if they are, then, I wonder aloud why they haven't asked if they can bring them, which is always a surprise. And in a way, that is something that I'm being more active about. But again, it's an interesting, another layer of communication. There's this other creature in the room, and how the patient handles, I handle, just what we do with the presence of this usually pretty docile creature in the room is always interesting. I mean, there's a paper by Michael Parsons in which he allows a very vulnerable and ill and old dog to come into the room, and the dog vomits. And he talks about how he and the patient clear up together. It's quite moving.
You've written about the importance of not working. Do you have any thoughts on all the lockdown aspirations that everybody had? And just this idea that we were somehow supposed to emerge from this time better and some bit more polished.
Yeah, I'm still trying to work it out, actually, and I'm trying to work out this sort of the arc that seems now retrospectively to be almost inevitably sort of an arc of disenchantment, that I was so struck by the initial atmosphere, rhetoric that was circulating in the early days of lockdown. And in a way, its utopianism did seem to make not working quite a prescient book. And, I had various organs coming to me and saying, could you write something about this? What's really interesting to me is that at the other end of the lockdown, of the sort of the pandemic lockdown, the second or third lockdown, I didn't get so many calls like that. And the book, in a way, seemed less prescient because, although I think I do talk about the difficult aspects of not working and of sort of withdrawal and of not doing anything, I don't think the book is intended as a sort of, as merely a kind of utopian tribute to inactivity. But inevitably, I think that's what people were really interested in. And in the first lockdown, all the losses seemed like gains. The loss of traffic meant the return of the sense of hearing and smell. Birdsong was, the gift that everyone talked about emerging in these urban spaces. The various environmental gains. And accompanying all of those gains in nature and the external world was a gain in our relationship to our own interiority. There was talk about a kind of a new space to commune with ourselves, which was sort of gifted practically by not having to travel to work, and generally life occurring within a much narrower circuit, which meant that we weren't pulled between different locations internally or externally, And so we just had more time to be with ourselves, to encounter ourselves, to enter into a kind of dialogue. And attached to that was a more pious and, I think after a while, more persecuting rhetoric of it's an opportunity to do things with oneself, to learn a language, or baking, or getting fitter, or that in a way all of these very laudable, worthwhile activities would fill the space that had been vacated by a lot of noisy, frenetic activity before. And so we would, as you say, come out some kind of better, more rounded human beings. I think some of that happened. People start to enjoy some of that. Now, I wasn't surprised at all at people getting fed up with it at a certain point. The novelty wearing off, and whatever had seemed sort of affirmative and restorative about it suddenly starting to feel oppressive and suffocating. That didn't surprise me so much. I think what did surprise me was the way that these gains in time also started to feel like losses. The big example in psychotherapy practice, and I don't know if you had this as well, but people started to complain that there was no journey to work, to the session. And the loss of the journey to the session was the loss of a sort of space for switching out between one psychic location and another. That, of course, it's very different being at work and being in a session. And the journey was, in a way, a passageway, a tunnel, from one psychic state to another, so that one could arrive, more in tune with oneself. Whereas what was happening now is that they were clicking out of one Zoom meeting and coming into the next one, which happened to be their session, and that was in their calendar. And so the differentiation that journeys allowed between one kind of space and another was erased. And I was struck and initially quite dismayed by the way that, and there was a practical element to this as well, because for the first few months of Zoom life, I think a lot of workplaces were adapting themselves to the Zoom environment, and that also left people with more time. Whereas once they'd installed themselves, sort of from beginning to end, online, all those gaps were filled. And so what had seemed like a gain in time to be with oneself and time to be away from work was suddenly time that work had managed to claim with a vengeance. And often, usually, almost always, with the collusion of the workers themselves, that the sort of natural breaks that are afforded by being somewhere else got lost and filled by, well, I suppose I could do this and I could do that. But that loss of differentiation between one psychic space and another meant that often people were coming into the sessions with a kind of business-like tone, a kind of problem-solving orientation, and that sense that the consulting room provided of a different atmosphere, of a kind of invitation to occupy a different space, that was gone. We were just two people in our own separate spaces talking to each other, and their separate space didn't feel differentiated at all often, and there were homeschooled kids, frustrated and bored and unhappy, kind of, hovering outside the door. And so that's the arc of disenchantment that I'm talking about, really, that the pandemic was very much a hope of, brought in, arrived very much with a hope of changing our relationship to our interiority and our time. And it ended up serving the external world, the sort of demands of the external world, more efficiently, or at least more anxiously and guiltily as well.
Guiltily?
Yes, in the sense that there are various kind of hours and spaces of reprieve. Obviously, when you're travelling to work, when you have a lunch hour that you're using to be with somebody else, sit in a cafe with a colleague, or if you have a water cooler, the water cooler moment, the corridor moments, those moments which are both of and not of work, those ambiguous times that actually the workplace can provide, and that the laptop is maybe less able to provide. And of course, there's the family that you might have at home. There's that kind of distraction, but the family, when it's another demand to be managed, soon starts to feel like work itself, like an extension of work, a kind of... and so I think people became a lot more guilty, particularly in the second lockdown, about those moments in which they just weren't using efficiently and productively and purposefully.
So they became guilty about those moments of ambiguous reprieve.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think that I particularly noticed this at the beginnings of sessions, when so often people would say to me, "Sorry, I've just come out of a work meeting," and it became evident to me that a lot of that space of ambiguous reprieve had just been excised from people's sense of their day, of the texture of their day. Just wasn't woven in.
There's this moment in the private life, which I really like, where you describe yourself sitting, I think it's in your grandfather's study or library, and not answering your grandmother's sort of increasingly demanding calls for attention. It would just seem to chime so much with this experience of people barely getting any time to them, living in house shares or with families. And I wonder if you heard about or noticed any forms of protest that allowed people to get time to themselves, or just your thoughts on what happened to privacy during the lockdowns.
Yeah. I think, again, this was a sort of, part of that arc of disenchantment, that lockdown initially felt like a kind of an enhancer of privacy, even something that would reintroduce people to the value of privacy, and of interiority as something substantial, rather than a kind of gap in the day. I think when people are in a very frenetic frame of mind and sort of permanently active, then interior life can feel like a sort of inconvenient distraction. And so initially there was some substance to ordinary private life, to having a moment alone with yourself. But certainly people who were living in households with more than one person, I think privacy became a bit of a battleground and a struggle that, yes, there was protest. Certainly in my consulting room, people talked about, so I just went to my bedroom. I went to my bedroom because it was the only place that I could be guaranteed 5 minutes to myself before, the annoying child or the annoying husband came in and spoiled it for them. But privacy that is sort of wrested from noise and from non-privacy under duress feels very different from privacy that is sort of freely claimed and desired. It feels more like being under siege than being in a state of refuge. It feels like a matter of survival rather than a matter of really sort of thriving. And in any sort of people who are living in any kind of common space with anybody else, I think often felt that the privacy they had was hard won and couldn't be sort of claimed. I think, I talk to people often about why it was so difficult to be able to say to somebody, actually, I just want to be on my own for an hour. I'm not sure if lockdown and the pandemic made that harder. I think it was something like, well, we all have to do this, and if you go and do your own thing, well, you leave me with it. And that sort of ordinary dynamic of family and couple life, which is scratchy and where demands are sort of continually running into each other and rubbing against each other and creating friction. There's nonetheless, I think, when you're not in the house the whole time, it somehow feels possible to accommodate and to be more tolerant of those competing demands. But when you're sharing the same space, maybe, and you're having to accommodate each other all the time, then it's very hard both for the person who grants, if you like, the hour off to one partner and the partner who takes it. It's very hard for them not to feel the resentment kind of coursing between them. And certainly, again, that was a story that came up again and again, listening to people in lockdown, and funnily enough, I think that it's much harder to be the debtor in that situation, to be the one who owes than the one who is owed. To sort of take something for yourself and say, right, now I need to be grateful to the other person is much more difficult than to be, the resentful martyr who says, well, that was very generous of me. I could have done with an hour off.
Do you think it's the debt that makes that difficult, or do you think there's something particular about taking that time for solitude?
I think that they're almost the same thing a lot of the time. I'm always kind of fascinated by the fact that in German, the word for debt and the word for guilt, Schuld, are the same. And that sort of semantic convergence of the two, I think, is just so instructive. I think that it is a lot about debt, the difficulty. And so that makes it difficult for the solitary time to be authentically solitary, because a lot of it might be spent sort of prosecuting an argument internally with the resentful partner, say. But I do think that in these confined spaces where privacy is scarce, solitude is more difficult to claim and to inhabit. Because even if you have a room that is physically sealed off from the rest of the household, you know, a good attic room or something, or even a good garden, there is, I think, this sense of, you know, there are invisible strings pulling on you as you're doing it, so that in your mind you're always justifying. Well, not everyone. Some people are just good at saying what they need and taking it. But for a lot of people, guilt means that they spend a lot of the time they have off justifying the fact of having time off, instead of really being able to use it and clear out this cacophony of other voices, you know, mostly fantasized other voices telling them that they're being selfish, or that they have a lot of stuff to do and they need to get on with it. Everything, in other words, that spoils the privacy that the person's trying to claim.
Yes, I think it's Montaigne in his essay on Solitude says that you can go away wherever, but you can still carry the court with you inside your head.
Absolutely.
And I think that there's something about guilt or just having a very vocal kind of superegoic voice that's quite the enemy of time spent.
Yeah, and the other side of that coin of Montaigne's is that, you know, there are people who have the capacity to be with themselves even in a crowd, and to tune out the noise around them when they need to. And again, you know, listen in the consulting room, and that often becomes an object of resentment. Someone talking about a partner who tunes out, and isn't it convenient for them to be able to tune out? I wish I could do that. Or somebody talking about being resented because they're actually quite skilled at doing this. But I think it can be very important to have that capacity to be in contact with yourself when the environment you're in becomes overwhelming.
Do you have any thoughts about what makes that possible?
Yeah, I think I would probably think a lot about this through Winnicott. Winnicott, of course, has that famous essay about the capacity to be alone in the presence of another. And that paradox that the other person sort of, you know, the carer, sort of, instead of intruding on your solitude, lines and protects your solitude, and facilitates it, encourages imaginative life. And that's something that's lost as we become sort of active, responsible, tax-paying adults. You know, that the presence of another ceases to become a kind of facilitating parallel presence. That idea that you can be alongside someone without intruding on them, I think, becomes more and more difficult for a lot of adults. And it feels as though they're withdrawing, or they're withholding, or they're depriving the other. So I think often a good early experience, having sort of accumulated a sense of the value of one's own private life, of knowing what it is to be solitary and being able to claim that knowledge for yourself and put a value on it. That's very important, I think, for being able to claim your privacy when you most need it and when it might be very difficult to do that. And I think, again, this is a reference to Winnicott, but Winnicott talks quite positively about the value of ruthlessness. And ruthlessness is something that he associates with what he calls the capacity to use an object. And using an object and ruthlessness sound how they sound, very moralizing. One shouldn't use people and one shouldn't be ruthless. But actually, using in Winnicott's language is a positive, because what it means is that a person you can use somebody when you've established the difference between yourself and them. When you've given them the externality that is their due, you can then use them because you can only use someone else. And that requires a certain ruthlessness, which I think, again, a certain kind of infancy facilitates. An infancy in which the infant has been allowed to experience themselves as separate, as another mind. If, on the other hand, there's always been either guilt or a kind of diminishment of interior life, if you've been told that, sitting in your room drawing pictures is silly and you should be helping out, or you should be seeing friends, or you should be, running around outside, or even doing your schoolwork, but that kind of time spent in the space of your own imagination, if you're told that doesn't really have a substance of its own, you're going to find it very difficult to cultivate that for yourself later on.
I'm really interested in Marion Milner, and so much of her work comes back to how, and of course she's so closely intertwined with Winnicott's thinking, but so much of it comes back to just how much guilt gets in the way of being alone, just even in being able to occupy the space of solitude. And I think ruthlessness comes into it, because there's a certain kind of guilt that can follow upon an attempt to use somebody else, or an attempt to claim something. So I've encountered, just in sort of newspapers but also amongst friends, this sense that we kind of have to make up for lost time now that we're kind of out of this pandemic, but also possibly heading into something else.
Yes, exactly.
And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that. I suppose we've been talking about time a fair bit, and this seems to be another kind of relation to time.
Yeah, as a sentiment, it feels so ambiguous to say we need to make up for lost time, because if what we're talking about is desire, if what we're talking about is sort of being in touch again with the expansiveness and variety of a faculty of desire, then fine. That I suppose you could call making up for lost time. I feel like, again, a language of debt very quickly gets into it, as though you owe it. Sometimes in a kind of, neoliberal language, you owe it to yourself. And I always find this very interesting, this debt that you owe to yourself, because it feels like a kind of, it's meant to sound like self-gifting or like self-care. And yet it very easily shades into an imperative. You owe it to yourself to enjoy yourself again, to return to and indulge in the kind of social life, the kind of cultural life, the kind of collective life. You should claim that back. And I think people sometimes experience it as a social imperative as well, as though you don't want to let the side down by not going back to parties, not going back to the theatre, not sort of tuning in to this reanimation of collective life. And so I feel like there's a sort of small band of resistors that, I don't know, tune into each other, that say something really scandalous, which is, yeah, I liked the pandemic. There's a lot that I miss about it. People can, I think, there is space to talk about how difficult the transition is. But even then, the talk of the difficulty seems often to have a tacit assumption that, you want to overcome this difficulty because what you ought to be doing is making up for lost time, and returning to a norm. So that the idea that the pandemic might have insinuated a space in which to reevaluate our relationship to activity, again, it just gets crowded out of the conversation, of the internal conversation. Apart from anything, it isn't presented as an option to say, well, I've discovered something about myself and my relationship to my own solitude, maybe I'd like to retain something of that. Maybe, all these losses that we're talking about were gains for me, and I would like to hold on to them. That I think, that does get hedged very quickly with guilt or just uncertainty. Is there something wrong with me? A kind of pathologizing.
There's something in what you've been saying, this kind of interlocking of an account of a kind of work economic system that creates its own pressures, and then there's an account of like the dynamics of psychic life. And I think when you were talking about the capacity to be alone and saying that an infant can start off with an other who seems to be this buffering, cushioning presence, and then the quality of that other seems to change perhaps when they're older, it becomes more extracting or demanding. And right now when you were talking about this sort of debt owed to yourself, or maybe even to like a sort of system of consumption in terms to get back out there, that seems quite it's just something that I've been hearing in a lot of what you've been saying, this kind of interlocking, and I just wondered if kind of to close this conversation you could say something about that.
Can you say more about the interlocking? Can you just...
Yes, so what do you think changes the quality of this other who started off as buffering, and then by the time you're, say, 30 and have a job, and perhaps a relationship, this other's become this extractive, anti-solitude presence?
I'm always really moved observing the phenomenon of parallel play in very young children. And I think I had to get past a certain age to have that response to it. I used to find it amusing, and I used to find it a sort of sweet and comical illustration of the solipsism of children, that they could be alongside each other and really not acknowledge each other at all. But now I find that level of co-presence has a kind of unconscious, almost an unconscious sophistication to it. The capacity for children to inhabit a space that belongs entirely to them, that the other person doesn't intrude upon, and yet in the parallel itself, the other is acknowledged. And it feels like the original model for a version of friendship that Emerson talks about in his great essay on friendship, where he says that the real condition for friendship is not proximity or intimacy, but distance. That friendship consists in bearing witness to the separateness and otherness of the friend, and that we have sentimentalized friendship by imagining that it has something to do with what we call these days relatability, with a kind of crude empathy where you have to say, oh yes, I know what that feels like, oh, I know all about that. And so the curiosity about difference gets closed down in that sentimental version of friendship. And I think we are instilled as we get older with a sense of social and interpersonal responsibility to be interested in, to tune into, and to comply with as well the interests and desires of the other. And so instead of two people getting together, talking about their own inner lives and their own interests, and allowing those to run alongside one another, and opening up a different kind of curiosity in which you can observe somebody from the distance of your own interests, curiosities. Instead, the curiosities have to converge. You have to sort of share stuff. You have to want to see the same films. You have to want to play the same games. Now, at one level you can see, well, wouldn't this be just a logical prerequisite for what we call social life? But the trouble is, it becomes so constricted, it becomes so exclusive a model for social life that it crowds out other possibilities. And, you know, one thinker that really interests me as well in this regard is Roland Barthes, particularly in his late seminars, where he starts, in his seminar on how to live together, he starts to talk about this model of social being he calls idiorhythmy, which is being able to live according to the rhythms of one's own desire without intruding on the rhythms of the desire of the person next to me. And this feels to me like a kind of adult elaboration of parallel play, really. It's a sort of a society in parallel play. That doesn't preclude the possibility that, of course, sometimes you'll converge and love the same things and want to share the same experiences. I'm just interested in how it is we lose the capacity for that parallel experience, for relating to each other from distance as well as from proximity or shared experience.